Welcome, Magnus here. Today's video we're going to talk about the R5 and the R5 Mark II, specifically when it comes to overheating in video, and my thoughts on what we can expect with the R5 Mark II and its overheating situation. Now, I've done research on different videos when it comes to early thoughts on the R5 Mark II, and something that not only the actual manual that has been released online has made it clear, but also other YouTube creators have also shared the fact that it does overheat. Now let's talk about R5 and R5 Mark II. Which one's better when it comes to recording in an overheating situation? If you're new to this channel, my name is Magnus, and I like to talk about cameras, mirrorless cameras, in terms of video, not so much photography. So if you like that type of stuff, definitely consider subscribing. Now, the reason I want to talk about this topic today is because the R5 Mark I, the original R5 that was released in January 30th, 2020, was a camera that had incredible specs, next level specs that nobody expected from Canon, because Canon was slow on their high resolution full frame video specs when it comes to the cameras released before then. It was like, when are we going to get full frame 4K video? Right now I'm recording on the 5D Mark IV, which was released in August of 2016, which was kind of like the DSLR predecessor of the Canon R5. And this predecessor was one of the first Canon cameras that were DSLRs that can actually shoot 4K. The caveat was that the 4K was not full frame, even though the sensor was full frame. It was just a 1.74 times crop. And the format that it had to record in was MJPEG, which were huge files with not a lot of usable color information that can give you extra leniency when it comes to editing and post. It gave you 8-bit 422, not even 10-bit, when other cameras were actually releasing with 10-bit color footage in log. The Canon 5D Mark IV did not come with log. You actually had to get that in a later upgrade, and its usage was limited, still possible, but again limited, with 8-bit 422 color information. Moving on from there, when R5 came out, it could do 8K at up to 30 frames per second, 4K at up to 120 frames per second. Come on, like, this is nothing that any other Canon mirrorless camera was even competing with at the time. So it was an amazing upgrade. However, the biggest issue that it had when the camera was released was the fact that this thing would overheat very fast when you're recording an 8K or oversampled 4K footage. Although it didn't overheat as fast as the 8K did. You had 15 minutes of record time when recording an 8K before this thing would just basically stop due to overheating, and that wasn't usable. Now, that controversy potentially caused Canon a lot of sales to be lost when compared to the Sony a7S III at the time, which released right after the Canon R5, and it had 4K 120, and it had great looking 4K and a bunch of other features with no overheating. Though it didn't have the 8K, that actually came later from Sony, but Sony was handling it. Whereas the R5 was plagued with that overheating issue where no one would even want to purchase the camera anymore, although it did do pretty well. Until much later, when firmware updates made it so that now that you can basically record 8K with no issue, and 4K downsampled from the 8K with, again, no issue. And the 4K 120, it would overheat, but it could last up to like 45 minutes, which who would record that much slow-mo? You're talking a lot of footage before this camera would even overheat. So it was not really a problem. But now we're here at 2024 with the release of the R5 Mark II, and this thing also does 8K, but at up to 60 frames per second. Does 4K at 120 frames per second, and it does HD at 240 frames per second, which honestly the original R5 should have done, but it doesn't. However, let's talk about the expectations when comparing the original R5 to the R5 Mark II. Now, I'm not going to give you exact times, because even though you can look up the manual and see the recommended exact times, you really never know, because that's variable depending on temperature that you're at and what you're doing. All I'm going to talk about is, will it overheat or wouldn't it overheat when compared to the original R5. Now, let's start with 8K60. Now, 8K60 cannot be done on the original R5. The R5C can, but the original R5 can't do it. R5 Mark II will be able to do it. Now, that 8K60, it's going to be incredible. That is expected to overheat the camera on the R5 Mark II, but on the R5C, it didn't overheat. Now, the difference and the reason that this is because the original R5C has a built-in fan. And even though you have to power it externally to get it to work, all of the innards and everything is being properly cooled to handle 8K at 60 frames per second. Whereas the R5 Mark II, though it has vents, it does not have an internal fan. Now, you could extend that time if you buy that adapter that will let you actually blow air through those vents. But from what I hear, time would be still limited. So that kind of sucks. Now let's talk about just 8K 30 frames per second. Now the original R5 can do 8K at 30 frames per second. The R5 Mark II can also do 8K at 30 frames per second. However, the 8K in the R5 Mark II is expected to overheat before the original R5 Mark I would. Now, this is not talking about originally when the R5 Mark I was released, because the 8K recorded was limited to 15 minutes before it would overheat on you. But after the firmware update 1.6 on the R5 Mark I, that basically went away. I could record now, and even if I set my camera right now, I've got the R5, I'm turning it on, I'm setting it to record 8K at 30 frames per second, but the camera right now is telling me that it's got the full 30 minutes, and that's including the overheating time limit. Full 30 minutes to record 8K at 30 frames per second. Now the R5 Mark II, from what I hear, it's may come close, but it's still going to overheat on you sooner than the R5 Mark I. And the R5 Mark I can record well over an hour without any issue. Again, I'm speaking without the venting system. Now, what's interesting and a question that you may have is, why can the original R5 go longer than the R5 Mark II, even though they're both recording the same quality footage? The sensor itself is the same resolution. They're both 45 megapixel cameras. So why is it that the R5 Mark II would overheat sooner? And it has vents. And the original R5 Mark I does not have any vents. This thing is pretty well weather sealed. So you're not going to get any vents here, but yet it still lasts longer. I have a theory about that. Not that I can confirm that with Canon, but my theory is that the processor is the Digic X processor. So it's the same processor as the original R5. But you've also got this advanced engine that's also in here. This second processor that helps with the autofocus is also going to produce heat in the camera. Now, when both are working in tandem, and they will, because one would assume that you're going to autofocus on the camera when you're recording video, because you just got to. You've got amazing autofocus on this camera. Those both processors are producing heat, and even though it's being vented, it's got that vent, it's not going to be enough to release all of that hot air with these new processors working in tandem together. This is what's causing the camera to heat up even more, and that unfortunately leads to the fact that the camera is going to overheat a lot sooner than the R5 Mark I. Moving on, 4K 120, the original R5 is going to last longer than the R5 Mark II, and you're going to have oversampled 4K 30. Again, R5 Mark I is going to last a lot longer than the R5 Mark II. So where does that leave us? We're getting, at least from initial standpoints, if the new camera is overheating a lot more than the original camera, why buy the new camera? What's the advantage of the new camera if you're using this for video? I think there are a couple of reasons that you'd want to use the new camera, but I'm still keeping the old camera. First, the R5 Mark II can record without a 30-minute time limit. Chances are that you're recording these long sessions, and when you're recording these long sessions, some of them can be over 30 minutes. You really can't predict, especially if you're doing an interview. And if you can get that footage to not cut off at 30 minutes, that's an advantage that you get with the R5 Mark II. Keeping in mind that you will still have to keep an eye out on that overheating. So it's kind of like a trade-off and a risk, but there's potential there. You'll see that the R5 Mark II will get longer recording times. Though, I wouldn't buy it holding out for those updates in firmware. In fact, if you need that longer recording times in this newer camera, maybe you should wait before purchase. However, I do believe that it will happen. However, I'm not counting on it. Can I use the camera before those updates, given what they've actually released in press releases and in the manual? Yeah, I think it'll be doable. However, I honestly, if I really need something that's going to be 8K RAW or 4K enhanced HQ, and I could stop at the half-hour mark and continue going from there, but I really need to keep it going, then I'm going to use the original R5 rather than the R5 Mark II in those specific cases. But the enhanced dynamic range that you get off of it and the other features like 4K SRAW, yes, please give me that, because I can use those modes and really push my creativity to the limits without worrying so much about card space or high resolution video when I don't need it, which is not the case in all situations, but sometimes I do need it. But that's really what I expect, and actually the reason why I pre-ordered the R5 Mark II is because it does handle what I need with its current limitations, and I'll be fine. So those are my thoughts on the R5 Mark II and the overheating issues. Will they be a problem? Not really, but there will be times where the original R5 will be preferred when compared to the R5 Mark II, but that will be in limited circumstances, I imagine. But we'll see when the camera actually comes out. Now, on a future video, I actually want to talk about the A7S4. Now, 4 years ago, when Canon announced the original R5, Sony a couple weeks later was like, hey, A7S3. So will Sony actually do that again? Potentially they already have by the time I release this video, but we'll see what they do and how they counter the R5, because they did do a pretty good job of stealing some sales. But let me know what you guys think on comments down below. Is the R5 Mark II something that you'll look into even with these overheating questionable situations? Or are you looking at the A7S4 once that's announced and out there? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys next time.
Magnus Video Productions, the place to